Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Tennessee. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The spring of 1862 found western Tennessee heavy with the scent of rain and gunpowder. The Civil War had just cut through the state like a jagged wound. Not far from the Tennessee River, the earth still bore the blackened traces of campfires and hastily dug graves from what history remembers as the Battle of Shiloh, one of the bloodiest encounters of its time. The dead had been buried, the wounded hauled away. But in the small town of Hollow Creek, whispers spread that not every body left the battlefield intact. It was here that a man named Elias Crane appeared. The records from the county courthouse describe him as of medium height, dark of hair, with a scar across the left cheek, occupation unknown. He arrived alone, pushing a mule cart carrying nothing but a canvas tarp, a tin kettle, and what appeared to be field tools. Some believed he had been a scout for one of the regiments that passed through after Shiloh. Others said he came from the mountains, looking for work repairing fences and barns destroyed by artillery fire. The local innkeeper, Mrs. Althea Lorne, wrote in her ledger that Crane paid 3 nights in advance, took no supper, and avoided the company of men. Another note, scrawled by the town constable weeks later, read simply, "Crane seen near the riverbank at dusk, digging." Hollow Creek was a place where rumor traveled faster than news. The war had emptied many farms, and those who remained were hard-eyed and weary. They watched Crane with a mixture of suspicion and pity. Suspicion because he spoke little, and pity because he seemed to be haunted by something unseen. By late May, the first disappearance occurred. A young farmhand named Levi Porter, recently returned from the militia lines, failed to show up for work at the mill. His mother reported him missing 3 days later. The constable searched the fields and the riverbank. He found Levi's cap tangled in a root near the bend, but no trace of the boy himself. 2 days after that, Crane checked out of the inn without a word. Mrs. Lorne said she found coins neatly stacked on the bedside table and the faint smell of smoke in the room. Beneath the bed, she discovered something far stranger, a torn piece of military uniform, marked with initials belonging to a soldier who had been declared missing after Shiloh. The next entry in the county records is dated June 4, 1862. It mentions the reopening of several shallow graves near the river. The description is brief but chilling. Remains disturbed, bones missing. Even then, no one could imagine what Hollow Creek was about to uncover. The summer heat in Hollow Creek made the air thick and slow, like syrup over scorched earth. After the disappearances, most people wanted to forget the name Elias Crane, but the sheriff, Amos Reddin, kept a small leather ledger of his own. Within it he recorded every detail of the strange happenings after the Battle of Shiloh. Unaccounted for livestock, missing farmhands, and scattered remains found near the lower river bend. Reddin's first witness was a ferryman named Isaac Tolliver. Tolliver told the sheriff that he often saw a lantern moving through the fog at night, somewhere along the north bank. At first he thought it was grave robbers, then deserters searching for rations. But one night he claimed he saw Crane himself, knee-deep in the mud, dragging what looked like a bundle wrapped in canvas. "I called out to him," Tolliver said, "but he didn't look up. Just kept dragging, slow as a mule underwater." The next morning, the ferryman found the spot empty, only a deep pit, half filled with water, and the smell of iron and rot. When the sheriff rode out there, he marked the place with a stake, but found nothing worth keeping as evidence. "Could be an animal carcass," he noted, "but too heavy for deer." Across town, Reverend Halcomb began to worry about attendance. Church pews sat emptier each week, people whispering that the land itself had soured since the war. He preached that Shiloh had opened the gates of violence and that men like Elias Crane were its wandering echoes, souls unburied by their own sins. One Sunday after service, a widow named Clara May Reeves approached the Reverend trembling. She said Crane had helped repair her barn weeks earlier. He'd asked for no pay, only a meal and permission to sleep in her hayloft. In the morning she found him gone. but a set of footprints led down to her smokehouse, where the door hung open and several slabs of ark had vanished. She thought little of it until she discovered a small patch of cloth stuck under the latch. It was gray wool, the kind used in army uniforms. Redden collected that cloth himself and compared it with the piece from the inn. The weave matched exactly. Yet no one could prove anything. The town judge refused to issue a warrant, calling the claims wartime hysteria. As weeks passed, the river dropped with the drought, exposing silt and twisted roots. Boys fishing near the bend found fragments of bone and a broken buckle engraved with the initials LP. When word reached the sheriff, he sealed the area and ordered it kept from the eyes of women and children. The discovery never reached the Nashville papers. Communication lines were unreliable, and the war dominated every front page. Still, whispers carried farther than ink. A trader passing through from Corinth claimed to have met a man matching Crane's description in a logging camp near the Mississippi border, alone, quiet, eating little, working hard. He looked sickly, the trader said, like something was eating him from the inside out. Redden recorded that account too, drawing a thin line under the date, August 17, 1862. He wrote one final note that evening. Follow the river south. There's more buried there than any sermon can cover. The sheriff began his search at dawn. The river mist clung to his boots and pistol holster, as if the land itself refused to give up its secrets. He brought along Deputy Silas Ward, a quiet man known for his steadiness, and together they followed the faint path southward along the bend. The ground was uneven, scarred by old trenches and wagon ruts from the war supply lines that once crossed here. Not far from the bank, they found a shallow depression covered with branches. The smell came first, thick, metallic, unmistakable. Ward gagged into his sleeve while Redden cleared the brush. Beneath lay a pit, wide enough for 2 men, its sides reinforced crudely with planks. Something had lived or died down there. Inside they found rags, bones stripped clean, and a rusted cooking pot blackened from repeated fire. The sheriff noted, some remains human, some animal, indistinguishable without examination. He sent Ward back to town for the physician, Dr. Wexler, who had once served in a field hospital near Shiloh. When the doctor arrived, he examined the pit with a soldier's detachment. These were not battlefield dead, he said grimly. This is something else. Word of the discovery spread through Hollow Creek faster than the sheriff could contain it. Mothers barred their doors at night. Men who had fought beside strangers began eyeing each other differently. Reverend Halcombe called for a vigil, insisting that sin had taken on flesh and walked among them. In the courthouse, Redden compared notes from old militia rosters. Elias Crane's name appeared nowhere. Yet in a list of field laborers requisitioned for burial duty after Shiloh, one name caught his eye, Elijah Cran, marked with the note missing, presumed dead. Whether it was the same man or coincidence, he couldn't say. But the handwriting matched the quartermaster's log from Corinth, dated only a week before Crane appeared in Hollow Creek. The next morning, Redden rode south along the river again, tracing fresh footprints in the mud. They led him to an abandoned smokehouse, half sunk into the earth. Inside, the air was heavy and sweet with decay. He found hooks hanging from the beams, each wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped one, a small bone fell to the floor. Not animal, Wexler confirmed later. That night the sheriff wrote his first official report to the county seat. It was never filed. The telegraph lines were down, and by the time they were repaired, Redden himself had disappeared. His horse was found tethered near the ferry crossing, reins coiled neatly, as if he'd stepped away only for a moment. In his saddlebags lay the half-burned pages of his notes, a map of the river bend, and a single line written across the margin. Crane does not flee. He waits. The next morning, a trail of footprints led from the ferry landing into the fog and vanished halfway across the sandbar. By mid-September, Hollow Creek had gone silent. The sheriff's disappearance struck the town like a thunderclap. For the first time in memory, the bell of St. Elora's chapel tolled not for war dead, but for a man whose badge still hung on its hook. Deputy Silas Ward took temporary charge, though his hand shook whenever he signed a notice. Ward organized a search party, 8 men, most of them veterans too young to forget the stench of battle. They combed the riverbanks, the smokehouse, and the nearby woods. At dusk they discovered something half buried in the mud. Reddin's pocket watch, still ticking faintly, though its face was cracked. Beside it lay a strip of leather torn from his saddlebag, and a lock of dark hair clotted with river silt. No tracks led away. Dr. Wexler suggested the river might have taken him, but the current near Hollow Creek was slow, shallow, and winding, too lazy to claim a horse and rider without leaving a trace. If he went under, Wexler murmured, someone helped him do it. The townsfolk began to whisper of Crane again. Mrs. Lawrence swore she'd seen him from her upstairs window the week before, the outline of a man on the ridge, carrying a shovel. When she lit her lamp, the figure turned and vanished into the tree line. Ward rode out there at dawn and found a crude campsite, a cold fire, tin scraps, and a single footprint pressed deep into the clay. The heel was worn unevenly, same as Crane's boot had been when he stayed at the inn. The deputy posted handbills in every nearby county, describing Crane as a man of sullen aspect, mid-30s, scar on left cheek, suspected grave robber. But there was little appetite for law work in wartime. Most marshals were chasing deserters, not rumors. The case soon dropped beneath the flood of war dispatches coming from Shiloh and Corinth. Still, Hollow Creek couldn't forget. Children were kept indoors. H. Hunters claimed to find bones scattered far from any burial site, clean to ivory, as though boiled. A peddler named Jonas Fry told Ward he'd sold Crane a length of rope and a butcher's knife weeks earlier. Said he was dressing hogs, Fry recalled, but I swear he didn't smell of pork. As autumn deepened, fog rose from the river every evening, clinging low and silver. Ward kept vigil from the courthouse steps, rifle across his knees. He wrote a final note in the sheriff's old ledger. The river gives back nothing but echoes. 3 nights later, a farmer downstream reported seeing 2 figures wading through the shallows, one leading, the other stumbling behind, bound at the wrists. By the time anyone reached the site, the moon had vanished behind the clouds and the prints were gone. Only a single button, brass and engraved AR, was found in the sand. Whether it belonged to Sheriff Amos Reddin or not, no one could tell. But after that night, the town stopped ringing its chapel bell altogether. By October of 1862, Hollow Creek was less a town than a cluster of shuttered homes staring into the fog. The blacksmith's forge went cold, the schoolhouse door hung unlatched, and the reverend's sermons drew only a handful of trembling parishioners. The war's thunder had rolled elsewhere, but what lingered here felt more poisonous than any battle. Deputy Ward, now sheriff by circumstance, stopped wearing his badge. He spent most nights on the porch of the courthouse, reading through the late Reddin's notes until the oil in his lamp ran dry. The same 3 words returned again and again in the sheriff's script: river, digging, and smoke. Ward began to suspect that Crane's crimes weren't random acts of hunger or madness. They followed a pattern. Sites close to the water, always near burned-out campfires, each marked by disturbed earth. That theory found support when the physician, Dr. Wexler, came forward with something strange. A boy fishing downstream had snagged a metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were pages of a soldier's journal, waterlogged but still legible. The last entry, dated April 12, 1862, described burial duty after the Battle of Shiloh. The writer mentioned a man named L. Cran, who insisted on digging alone, muttering prayers and refusing rations. The final line read, "He said the earth still hungered." Ward stared at the pages for hours. If L. Cran was indeed Elias Crane, then his sickness had begun on that field of corpses, not in Hollow Creek. Whatever he'd seen, or done, during Shiloh had followed him here. That same week, the widow Reeves reported hearing noises near her smokehouse again. She described them as low and heavy, like an animal's breathing. When Ward investigated, he found a dead coyote outside the door. Its chest opened with a precision no scavenger could manage. Inside the smokehouse hung strips of drying meat, none of them recognizable. Ward burned it all before dawn. The Reverend called for a town meeting, hoping to calm what little community remained. He spoke of redemption, of faith in troubled times. But when he mentioned the river, several people left in silence. Those who stayed said they felt the floorboards tremble, as though something moved beneath the church itself. The Reverend laughed nervously and dismissed it as wind beneath the boards. But that night he packed his belongings and rode east, leaving only a note on the pulpit. The Lord's voice does not dwell here any more. By November, Hollow Creek had lost 3 more souls, 2 farmers and a ferryman, all last seen near the southern bend. The pattern had returned. Sheriff Ward ordered the area cordoned off, though no one dared enforce it. The fog thickened each evening, rolling in from the river with a scent like burned metal. Dogs howled at nothing, and even the crickets went silent. In his final surviving report, Ward wrote a single paragraph that would later surface in county archives, decades after the town itself had vanished from maps. If Crane is still among us, he has learned to move like water, quiet, patient, shaping the land that once tried to bury him. Winter came early that year, hard and bitter. The river froze in patches, and the wind carried a hollow sound that made even the bravest men keep close to their fires. With Hollow Creek nearly abandoned, Sheriff Ward turned his attention to the remnants of the war encampments nearby, hoping they might hold records of Crane's origins. The nearest surviving camp lay 2 days' ride east, near Pittsburgh Landing, the same ground still haunted by the memory of the Battle of Shiloh. The field hospital there had long been dismantled, but in the cellar of a ruined chapel, Ward found wooden crates filled with military papers, supply logs, casualty lists, and a handful of journals too stained to read. He spent 2 nights there, lamp flickering against the damp walls, piecing together what he could. Among the papers, one entry stood out. It was the quartermaster's ledger, signed by Captain Leland Royce. The list included men assigned to burial detail following the battle. Beneath the neat handwriting of soldiers' names, one line appeared in darker ink, added later. It read, Elijah Crane, detail removed for misconduct, suspected desecration of corpses. The note was brief, no explanation given, but beside it someone, perhaps Royce himself, had drawn a small mark, half cross, half circle. Ward had seen that same mark before. It appeared in Reddin's final notebook sketches, drawn near every site along the river where bones were found. He took the ledger and rode back through sleet and fog, his horse stumbling through frozen mud. When he reached Hollow Creek, the few remaining townsfolk refused to come out. Doors were barred, chimneys cold. The only smoke rose from the old mill, where someone had lit a fire, though it hadn't been used in months. Ward approached cautiously, revolver in hand. The air inside was thick with soot, and something fouler beneath. Scattered across the floor were scraps of uniform cloth, Union and Confederate both, mixed with bones gnawed to splinters. In the center of the room lay a crude altar built from stones and river mud. On it, half buried, sat a jawbone, still wearing a gold filling. Pinned to the beam above it was a folded page from a field journal. Ward unfolded it with shaking hands. It was written in a tight, slanted script. The body is a vessel. The river remembers. That night, the mill burned. Witnesses later said they saw the flames long after the roof collapsed, burning blue against the fog. No one knew whether Ward started the fire himself or if it consumed him inside. His horse was found the next morning at the edge of town, reins cut, eyes wide and bloodshot. Dr. Wexler was the last to leave Hollow Creek that winter. He sealed the courthouse records in an iron chest and sent them to the county seat, marking them, Unresolved Inquiry, Elias Crane. Then he disappeared, leaving only a note for his wife. The man was never truly here, yet somehow he remains. Decades later, when state archivists reopened that chest, they found the pages brittle but intact. The official summary ended with a single line typed in 1911. Subject: Elias Crane. Status: presumed deceased. Crimes unconfirmed. Folklore persists. By the early 1870s, the war had faded into memory, and maps no longer marked Hollow Creek. The area was listed simply as unsettled ground, though the river still curved the same way, glinting dull and green under the morning mist. A railway survey brought new settlers, families from Kentucky and Georgia, looking for timber and cheap land. Among them was the Murdoch family, who built a modest cabin near the overgrown foundations of what had once been the mill. For the first few months, life seemed ordinary enough. The Murdochs cleared brush, planted corn, and reopened the old well beside the property. But one morning in late spring, young Thomas Murdoch came running from the fields, pale and shaking. He claimed he had found old bones laid out like they was sleeping. His father dismissed it as nonsense, until they followed the boy back to the site. Beneath a thin crust of soil, they uncovered a shallow trench filled with rib bones, each laid in parallel rows as though arranged by hand. The local surveyor, Mr. Crenshaw, was called to examine the site. He determined the bones were human, white and long-weathered, possibly Civil War dead. They reburied them under a cairn and said a prayer. But that night, the family heard scraping beneath the cabin floorboards. Mr. Murdoch pried up a plank and found nothing but damp earth. He sealed it again and told no one. 2 weeks later, the Murdoch's livestock began to vanish. Tracks led down toward the river, stopping abruptly where the bank fell away. Mrs. Murdoch said she saw a lantern light moving near the bend at night, too steady to be fireflies, too deliberate to be wind. Her husband went out one evening to confront whoever it was. He never returned. When neighbors came searching, they found the family's mule tethered to a tree, its reins slick with mud. Inside the cabin, the hearth was cold, but the floorboards had been pried up again. Beneath them lay a pit lined with planks and stones, freshly dug, the scent unmistakable. Of the Murdochs, only Thomas remained. He was found a mile downstream at dawn, sitting on a log, murmuring to himself. The doctor from the next county later wrote that the boy's hands were coated with clay and ash, as if he had been digging through a fire. The county authorities sealed off the land and ordered it left alone, citing unstable soil and disease risk. Yet, a few years later, a traveling merchant set up camp near the ruins. He wrote in his journal that the nights were unnaturally quiet, and that he had woken once to see a man standing knee-deep in the water, staring toward the shore. The figure did not move or speak, only tilted his head as if listening. When the merchant packed his wagon the next morning, he found footprints leading from the river straight to where his fire had been. They were deep, uneven, and trailed off into the woods. He left that same day and never returned. County officials reopened their files briefly in 1874, adding a note that referenced old records from 1862. The handwriting was different, but the conclusion the same. The pattern repeats along the river every decade. Graves disturbed, livestock taken, witnesses unwell. It was signed by an aging clerk named Silas Ward, the same man who had once been deputy under Sheriff Redden. He died that winter, his final journal entry reading, "I heard him again by the water. He still digs." In the summer of 1876, a journalist from Nashville named Henry Bales arrived in what remained of Hollow Creek. His editor at the Tennessee Gazette had sent him to write a human interest piece on the ghost towns of the South, stories that could fill the pages between politics and society columns. But when Bales reached the river bend, he found more than decay. He found silence that seemed to listen back. The road to the site was barely a path anymore, overgrown with sumac and willow. The remnants of the Murdoch cabin still stood, leaning as though the earth beneath it had shifted. The cairn of stones marking the old burial trench was scattered. Bales made notes in a small leather journal, describing a heaviness in the air, a smell of iron and wet wood. He camped that first night near the old well, determined to hear whatever the locals had whispered about for years. Before setting out, he had visited the county courthouse and spoken with the aging clerk, Mrs. Adeline Redden, widow of the lost sheriff. She still kept her husband's files locked in a trunk. After some persuasion, she allowed Bales to read them under her supervision. Inside were the yellowed pages of Sheriff Amos Redden's final notes, maps of the river, rough sketches of the mill, and one curious scrap labeled Elijah Cran, burial detail, Shiloh. Bales recognized the name immediately. He had once covered an anniversary memorial for the Battle of Shiloh, and the name Crane, or Cran, had appeared in old rosters marked missing, presumed dead. Mrs. Redden told him quietly, "My husband believed that man carried death home with him and never set it down." The journalist set up his tent at dusk. The fog rolled in low, curling around the trees like smoke. Around midnight, he heard movement near the well, slow, rhythmic, as if something heavy was being dragged. He lit his lantern, its glow barely piercing to the haze. There, by the edge of the clearing, he saw a figure crouched near the stones. For a moment, it seemed only a trick of the light, a man-shaped shadow bent over the earth. But when Bales called out, the figure straightened, revealing pale skin streaked with mud, eyes glinting amber in the lamplight. The next morning, Bales was gone. His horse was found tethered to a post, and his camp undisturbed, except for the journal, left open beside the cold ashes of his fire. The last page bore a smeared entry written in haste. It was not a ghost. It was a man, old, skin drawn tight, digging with bare hands where the ground still bleeds. Weeks later, his belongings were sent back to Nashville, but the story never made print. The Gazette editor received only a brief telegram from the county marshal. Missing person report filed. Suspect unknown. Site to remain sealed. By the turn of the century, Hollow Creek was erased from maps altogether. Only fishermen and surveyors spoke of it then, each with their own version of the tale. Some swore they saw campfire light flickering on foggy nights. Others claimed to hear shovels striking stone beneath the river's murmur. When a professor from Vanderbilt University visited the archives in 1909 to study war-era folklore, he stumbled across Redden's notes and Bales's final journal pages. His margin comment read simply, "The Shiloh dead were never all accounted for. Perhaps one remained to finish the count." In 1909, Professor Alaric Dunn of Vanderbilt University arrived in the small county seat of Benton's Ferry. His research focused on postbellum trauma and rural folklore, but colleagues whispered that he had an unhealthy fascination with graves. The archives there contained the sealed chest of documents marked Unresolved Inquiry, Elias Crane. Dunn requested access, citing academic study. The clerk, an old man with cataracts, handed him the key reluctantly and said, "What's buried in there never stopped breathing." Inside the chest, Dunn found hundreds of brittle pages, handwritten reports, sketches, affidavits, and a folded map of the Tennessee River marked with small crosses. Many were signed by the same names that had long since faded from record: Sheriff Amos Redden, Deputy Ward, Dr. Wexler. At the bottom of the pile lay the water-stained notebook belonging to journalist Henry Bales. Dunn read it by candlelight, tracing each entry until he reached the final half-torn page. The last sentence was still legible. "He waits by the bend, where the river forgets to move." The professor was no fool. He understood the line between fact and folklore better than most, but something about the repeated references to Shiloh, to unburied men and disturbed graves, stirred him. He cross-referenced the notes with official Union records and confirmed that a private named Elijah Crane had indeed been listed as missing from burial detail in April of 1862. The report stated simply, "Absent without leave, believed dead." Dunn decided to travel to the site himself. The county's newer residents warned him against it. They said the ground near Hollow Creek was still unstable, the trees warped, the air tainted. One woman told him, "Things grow strange there. Roots twist like bones, and nothing dies clean." He dismissed it as superstition and hired a local guide named Jonah Pike, a taciturn man who knew the river paths. They reached the old bend by late afternoon. Nothing of the town remained but mounds of earth where foundations had sunk, and the skeletal frame of what might once have been a mill. Dunn unpacked his camera and field journal. He was struck by how quiet it was. No birds, no insects, only the low hiss of wind through the cattails. When he examined the soil, he found fragments of iron hooks, shattered crockery, and a single brass button stamped AR, the same initials belonging to Sheriff Amos Redden. Jonah refused to stay past sundown, muttering that the fog walks here. Dunn set camp alone, determined to photograph the site by moonlight. He took 3 exposures before his camera jammed. The last image captured a faint shape near the riverbank, human in outline, bent as though digging. He convinced himself it was a shadow cast by the lantern. The next day, Dunn returned to Nashville and filed his notes. His report concluded with an unsettling hypothesis. If the accounts are accurate, Crane's obsession was not murder, but reclamation. He sought to return what the war had scattered, to complete the work of burial, even if flesh had long left the bone. 2 months later, Dunn's assistant developed the photographs. All were clear except the final one. The river appeared as a smear of light, and where the shadow should have been was instead a faint, elongated face, eyes wide open, mouth fixed in what might have been a grin or a scream. The image was quietly archived, never displayed publicly. Dunn himself withdrew from teaching the following year, citing night disturbances. His journal ended with a single line echoing those written half a century earlier. The river remembers. For decades, Professor Dunn's work gathered dust in Vanderbilt's archives, mentioned only in whispers among historians who studied the darker corners of post-war Tennessee. Then, in 1934, a graduate researcher named Evelyn Marrow came across the box labeled Dunn Collection, Hollow Creek Inquiry. She was cataloging Civil War artifacts for a regional exhibit and had never heard of Elias Crane. Inside, she found the professor's journals, several glass negatives, and a note in Dunn's trembling hand. "Do not expose to direct light after midnight." Of course she did. The photograph that emerged was faint but unmistakable. The riverbank under a waning moon, a lantern glimmering near the water, and a figure, human, stooped, one arm buried to the elbow in the ground. The longer she looked, the clearer it seemed that the figure's head was turned toward the camera. Even through the scratches on the plate, the expression appeared vacant and somehow aware. Evelyn brought the negative to her supervisor, who dismissed it as an exposure error. Still, he agreed to include it in a small exhibit titled Echoes of Shiloh, Life and Death Along the River. The photograph hung at the far end of the gallery, labeled only Unknown Subject, Tennessee River, 1909. Within the first week, 3 visitors complained of nausea while viewing it. One janitor refused to clean that section, claiming he heard wet digging noises after the lights were off. When Evelyn tried to print additional copies, she found the emulsion had deteriorated overnight. The image warped, the face stretching unnaturally. She noted in her diary, "The river in the photograph seems wider now. There are ripples where none were before." That same night, she dreamed of a man with mud on his hands, standing by her bed whispering, "Count them all." The exhibit closed early. Officially, the reason was humidity damage to the E-negatives, but several staff members later confided that the photograph had begun to change. The figure appeared closer each morning, as though advancing frame by frame. By the time the plate was removed, the shadow's hand reached the edge of the image. University records show that Evelyn resigned from her position shortly after. She moved to a small home near Franklin, where neighbors claimed she rarely left her porch and often burned papers in her yard. In 1937, a letter arrived at the Tennessee Historical Society from her address. It contained only one photograph, Elias Crane's alleged likeness, and a note scrawled in pencil, "If you bury the photograph, the ground will not keep it." The letter was filed under miscellaneous correspondence, but years later, when archivists attempted to locate it, the envelope was gone. The only surviving reference is in a curator's log that reads, "Received image from Mrs. Marrow, faded beyond recovery." Yet even today, some researchers swear that in certain light, a ghostly impression remains on the archive shelf, faint, sepia-toned, shaped like a man standing by the river's edge. And beside it, scratched into the wood, 3 letters carved with something sharp, E.C. The spring of 1942 brought the worst flood Tennessee had seen in a generation. Weeks of relentless rain swelled the river beyond its banks, swallowing farmland and washing away bridges. When the waters finally receded, entire tracts of old ground reemerged, raw, reshaped and glistening with the color of clay and bone. Among those newly exposed sites was the forgotten river bend where Hollow Creek had once stood. Locals from the nearby township of Paris Landing came to gawk at what the current had unearthed: chunks of timber, bits of rusted farm tools, and most disturbingly, several small wooden coffins wedged in the silt. The county coroner was summoned to examine them. His notes, now stored in the state archives, described the contents as partial remains, likely displaced from older graves, though curiously arranged in groups of 3. Each coffin lid bore the same faint carving, half cross, half circle. The sheriff of Benton County at the time, Walter Baines, ordered the area cordoned off. He was a pragmatic man, not given to superstition, but even he wrote in his report that the scene did not resemble any flood burial I have witnessed. What unsettled him most was the discovery of a bundle of documents sealed in a waxed pouch, tangled in tree roots near the waterline. Inside were several of Professor Dunn's missing pages, notes describing reinterment rituals, and a sketch of a man's face labeled Elias Crane, approximate reconstruction. The drawing matched the faded photograph taken in 1909 almost perfectly. The story quickly spread through the local press. One Nashville paper ran the headline, "Cannibal's Town Unearthed by Rising River." Reporters swarmed the site, quoting old-timers who remembered whispers of Hollow Creek. An elderly woman named Ruth Tolliver told a journalist, "My granddaddy used to say the river had a keeper, a man who never left his post." He sheriff tried to dismiss it as frontier myth, but the legend had already taken hold again. That same week, several fishermen working upstream claimed to have found more bones tangled in driftwood. The county morgue became crowded with fragments, most so old they crumbled under touch. Yet one discovery baffled investigators: a single boot, waterlogged but intact, containing a human foot preserved as if time had stopped. The leather tag inside bore faded initials, E.C. When a reporter asked Sheriff Baines whether he believed it belonged to the mythical Crane, he replied sharply, "That man's been dead 80 years. Let him stay that way." But privately, he confided to the coroner that he'd begun hearing odd sounds near the site: hammering, digging, always after dark. Once, while inspecting the recovered coffins, he swore he saw water seeping upward through the floorboards, though the room sat 30 feet above the river. The remains were quietly transferred to the State University for study, and the site was flooded again the following year under the newly constructed dam. Officially, Hollow Creek was gone for good, buried under hundreds of feet of water. Yet when divers surveyed the area in 1943, they reported strange structural formations beneath the surface. One described them as rows of stones laid too neatly to be natural. The diver's last log entry ended with the note the supervisor later underlined: "It looks like graves, fresh ones." When construction of the Hollow Creek Dam began in 1943, the Corps of Engineers saw it as progress, a chance to tame the river that had haunted the region for generations. The war effort demanded power, and Tennessee's waterways would help supply it. The valley was cleared, foundations reinforced, and what remained of the ghost town was marked for submersion. By autumn, workers reported finding old beams, charred timbers, and once, an entire stone hearth standing alone in the mud like a monument. It was logged and buried, without comment. But soon, the men began to talk. They spoke of finding bones too small to be animal, and of tools unearthed from the clay, shovels with their handles worn smooth, blades sharp despite their age. One foreman, Ernest Culp, noted in his field report that several workers refused to return after night shifts. They claim, he wrote, to hear knocking under the floodlight platforms, steady and deliberate, as if someone were digging from beneath. A laborer named Reed Haskell vanished one foggy morning while inspecting the lower embankment. His lantern was found upright in the mud, still burning. The next day, his body surfaced miles downstream, lodged among branches. The coroner ruled drowning, though Haskell's fingernails were packed with soil, not silt, and his jaw was locked as if from terror. His death was the 4th accident that month. Supervisors blamed exhaustion, but the pattern unsettled even them. In a confidential memo dated November 12, 1943, Project Director Harold Eames wrote to Washington, "Repeated disturbances at Section D, personnel morale deteriorating. Recommend limiting night operations until full review of ground stability." That review never came. 2 nights later, floodlights failed across the entire construction site. Workers described hearing a low vibration through the water, followed by a sound like shovels striking stone. By dawn, they discovered several pits opened along the shoreline, fresh, their edges clean-cut. Eames ordered the area sealed and the holes filled. When the mud settled, one of the men, an ex-sergeant from the war, claimed to see a handprint pressed into the clay, too deep for any living man to have made. By early 1944, the reservoir had filled, the valley disappeared beneath still water, and with it, the last remnants of Hollow Creek. The dam was christened Crane Hollow Lake, though the choice of name drew uneasy laughter. Officially, it was meant to honor the bird species common to the area, but to those who knew the old stories, it sounded more like a warning. After the dedication ceremony, Director Eames filed one final report. It included maps, rainfall data, and a single handwritten paragraph separate from the official record. At 0300 hours, divers checked the foundation for leakage. One returned screaming about a shape beneath the floodgate, long hair drifting, eyes open, face turned upward. I have since reassigned all night crews. No mention of that note ever appeared in government files, and Eames retired soon after. Years later, his daughter recalled that he refused to go near lakes for the rest of his life. When he died in 1961, his journal was found in his desk. The last entry read simply, "It's still down there, counting." By the early 1950s, Crane Hollow Lake had become a local attraction. Families picnicked along the shore, fishermen lined the docks, and the Army Corps boasted that the dam was one of the safest in the region. Yet those who lived closest to the water rarely swam. They said the lake had moods, calm one day, restless the next, and that sometimes it made a sound like breathing when the wind went still. The first drowning was written off as misadventure. A teenager named Eddie Larner vanished while diving near the old southern inlet. His friends claimed he surfaced once, gasped for help, then was yanked downward as if seized by something unseen. Divers recovered his body 3 days later. His lungs were filled not with lake water, but with silt and fine clay, the kind that lay deep beneath the original riverbed. The sheriff called it a curious anomaly and sealed the report. 2 months later, another body surfaced, this one a park ranger named Martha Hayes. She had been inspecting erosion near the dam when her radio went dead. Her watch had stopped at 3:17 a.m., the same hour recorded in Director Eames's old journal. Her skin bore shallow scratches along her arms, parallel and precise, as though made by fingernails. Investigators noted faint mud under her nails, too. Locals began whispering again. They said the water never really covered Hollow Creek, it merely hid it. Some nights, when the moon was high, fishermen claimed to see what looked like rooftops beneath the surface, or hear the clang of metal far below. One old man, a descendant of the Tollivers, told a reporter that he'd heard his grandfather's phrase repeated by the wind itself. "The river remembers." An engineer from Nashville named Paul Redden, great-grandson of Sheriff Amos Redden, visited the dam in 1954 while conducting safety inspections. He found the reservoir's pressure levels within normal range, but he grew disturbed by the sediment data. The riverbed beneath Section D, where workers had once reported the digging sounds, showed recurring cavities, as if the ground were collapsing in slow, rhythmic intervals. The report's margin bore a handwritten note. Could be geological movement, or something still shifting down there. That same year, several small earthquakes rattled the area, though no fault lines were recorded nearby. Residents described hearing muffled booms from beneath the lake, followed by bubbles rising through the surface. After one such tremor, a fisherman discovered a wooden beam floating near the dam, waterlogged but unmistakably old. Carved into it was a crude mark, half cross, half circle. When reporters pressed the county for answers, officials dismissed the stories as hill country superstition. But off the record, workers admitted they avoided night shifts at the control station. They claimed the intercom occasionally picked up a faint tapping, 3 slow knocks followed by silence. Some joked it was Elias Crane himself, keeping count under the dam. By 1956, drownings at Crane Hollow Lake averaged 2 per year. None were solved, none entirely explained. Families moved away, and property around the water lost value. The few who stayed said the lake had grown darker, more opaque, as if the river beneath were finally swallowing the light. One evening, a park ranger closing the gates heard someone calling his name from the water. He turned, saw only ripples, and beneath them, what looked like a hand reaching upward, palm open, as though offering something invisible. He left his post that night and never returned. The drought of 1972 dropped the waters of Crane Hollow Lake to their lowest level since its creation. For the first time in nearly 30 years, the outlines of the old riverbank began to show through the muddy shallows. Reporters from Memphis and Nashville arrived to cover what they called Tennessee's Atlantis. Among the curious were locals who had grown up hearing about Hollow Creek, the ghost town their grandparents warned them never to visit. What surfaced first were the tops of chimneys, blackened by time, and the curved stone walls of the old mill foundation. Then, as the water retreated farther, something stranger appeared, rows of wooden posts jutting from the mud, arranged in the shape of a rectangle. Archaeologists speculated it was part of an early homestead. But when they began to dig around the posts, they discovered small, uniform depressions in the earth, each about the size of a human body. The ground there was firm, almost preserved, and still carried the faint scent of smoke. A local historian, Dr. Samuel Harrow, petitioned to study the site. He had read fragments of the Elias Crane file years earlier while researching the aftermath of the Battle of Shiloh. His notes mention a persistent alignment of tragedy along the Tennessee River. Harrow arrived in August with 2 graduate students and began careful excavation. What they found confirmed decades of whispers, splintered bones, rusted implements, and in one pit, the remains of a military spade engraved EC. The students took photographs, which were later confiscated by the Corps of Engineers. The official statement said the items were of no historical significance, but Harrow told a reporter from the Clarion Ledger that the soil felt warm, almost breathing, and that one of his students fainted upon uncovering a hand that still had traces of dried skin. The article was never printed. Too wheat. Years later, the paper's editor received a letter from the federal office managing the dam, warning that further publication could interfere with national infrastructure operations. Then the rains returned. Within days, the pits were underwater again. Harrow stayed on the shore, taking notes as the lake rose to reclaim its dead. He later wrote in his private diary, "I've studied hundreds of sites, but this one is not a ruin. It's a wound. The water does not drown it. It feeds it." In October, Harrow vanished. His car was found near the dam, the driver's door open, keys still in the ignition. On the passenger seat lay his journal, soaked but legible. The last entry read, "Tonight the surface was still. I thought I saw lantern light beneath the water. Closer. Closer." The case drew brief attention before being buried by larger headlines. The Watergate hearings and the Vietnam conflict left little space for a vanishing professor. Yet those who lived near the lake noticed something change afterward. Fish died in droves that winter, washing ashore with bellies split as though from pressure. And when the ice formed over the water, locals claimed they saw faint shapes moving beneath it, rows of mounds like graves stretching toward the dam. One fisherman, the last of the old Tolliver line, was quoted years later saying, "The river's just waiting for its turn again. Every 50 years it takes a breath." In 1983, a regional television network from Nashville greenlit a small documentary titled The River That Remembers. It was meant to be a 1-hour broadcast exploring Tennessee folklore, haunted mines, lost towns, and unexplained disappearances. The production team, led by field director Gavin Rowe, had planned only a brief segment on Crane Hollow Lake. but what they found there would consume the entire project. The crew arrived in late September, just as the leaves began to turn. They rented a cabin near the dam and interviewed locals who still remembered the drought of '72. Most refused to speak on camera. One elderly man, a former maintenance worker, agreed to talk only off-record. His voice shook as he said, "You can drain that lake to its bones, but it'll fill itself again. Always does." Rowe's team shot establishing footage along the shoreline, wide pans of still water reflecting gray sky. On the second night, their sound technician recorded what he thought was an equipment fault, a rhythmic tapping faintly audible through the microphones, even when they weren't rolling. It continued for several minutes at irregular intervals. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. When they replayed the audio later, a whisper seemed buried in the static. No one could make out the words. The one cameraman insisted it sounded like counting. 2 days later, the divers arrived to capture underwater footage near the old town site. Using sonar, they located what appeared to be a rectangular depression, possibly a foundation or cellar. As they descended, the water turned from green to opaque brown. Visibility dropped to inches. The lead diver, Michael Trent, described seeing a shape, maybe a log, resting at the bottom. He reached out, and his hand struck something soft, almost pliant. Startled, he surfaced too fast, cutting the dive short. When Trent removed his glove, he found a small scrap of fabric clinging to it, dark gray wool with a hand-stitched seam. Later, the wardrobe specialist identified it as mid-19th century military cloth. That evening, the crew gathered in the cabin to review the day's footage. The first few minutes were murky. Then suddenly the camera panned downward and froze on an indistinct human figure kneeling in the silt. Its head was bent, one arm half buried in the earth. Before anyone could react, the lights in the cabin flickered. The film warped, colors bleeding red, and the recording stopped with a long hiss of static. The cameraman swore he hadn't pressed anything. Rowe wanted to continue filming, but 2 crew members refused to stay. They left that night for Nashville, taking one of the vans. The remaining team shot one last scene at dawn. Rowe speaking directly to camera on the dam walkway, summarizing the legend of Elias Crane. Behind him, mist drifted across the water. For a moment, the reflection in the lake showed 2 figures standing side by side, though Rowe was alone. The reflection moved a fraction later than his own, as if out of sync. When the footage reached the studio, editors reported electrical interference that destroyed most of the tapes. Only 12 minutes survived. The final shot shows Rowe staring into the lens, then glancing sharply over his shoulder. A faint voice is heard, dry, hoarse, almost swallowed by the wind. Count them. The documentary never aired. Officially, production was canceled due to budgetary issues. Unofficially, the footage was locked in the network's archive. Decades later, a partial reel surfaced online, mislabeled as local history B-roll. Viewers claimed to see a shadow in the background standing ankle-deep in the lake, watching as Rowe speaks. Rowe himself disappeared in 1985 while scouting a new location in Arkansas. His car was found near a reservoir. The odometer read exactly 186.2 miles from Nashville. By the 1990s, Crane Hollow Lake had become a quiet obsession for a new kind of investigator. The early internet historian, the paranormal enthusiast, the digital archivist. Scattered stories from the vanished documentary and local papers began circulating in niche forums devoted to American folklore. They called it The Cannibal's Bend. One thread claimed the name Elias Crane, appeared not only in war rosters from 1862, but also in property deeds as late as 1899. No one could verify it, but screenshots of old census scans, grainy, half-legible, spread like rumor always had in Hollow Creek. In 1994, a small team of urban explorers from Chattanooga visited the site after a mild drought lowered the lake again. They carried camcorders and flashlights, recording themselves wading through the shallow banks. The footage, later uploaded to local cable television as part of a Ghost Town special, captured the remains of wooden beams protruding from the mud. Near one post, the camera caught something unexpected, a half circle carved into the wood, crossed neatly at its center. The cameraman whispered, "Same mark as the stories." Moments later, the recording cuts to static. The next clear frame shows only rushing water, though no waves are visible in the background. One of the explorers, Jeff Collier, went missing that day. Search teams combed the area, finding only his camcorder, waterlogged but intact. The tape's final seconds depict the camera being lifted and turned toward its owner's face, eyes wide, mouth open, mud streaked across his cheeks. Then a sudden downward motion, a flash of light, and silence. The rest of the tape is blank. Investigators deemed the disappearance accidental. The remaining explorers refused to speak publicly, though one anonymously posted years later that they had seen lanterns under the water moving against the current. Another claimed to he's, or a man's voice counting steadily. 1, 2, 3, before vanishing into the noise of rushing water. Around the same time, the Tennessee Valley Authority conducted a maintenance inspection on the dam's intake tunnels. Divers sent below reported unusual sediment formations and the discovery of what appeared to be man-made objects embedded deep in the structure. Among them was a corroded metal plate stamped with the initials EC. When lifted, the plate crumbled in their hands, leaving only a dark residue that stained the divers' gloves. A short memo from the inspection supervisor, declassified decades later, included this line: "There are cavities under Section D. The sonar reads movement, rhythmic and localized. Recommend no further dives until structural integrity confirmed." No additional dives were recorded. The tunnels were quietly sealed with reinforced concrete. Officially, this was to prevent collapse. Unofficially, engineers later admitted it was to keep things from washing up. By the decade's end, Hollow Creek had become legend again, repackaged through online storytelling forums, whispered across message boards, even referenced in college folklore classes. Yet the original files, Professor Dunn's notes, Bales's journal, the sheriff's records, remained sealed in the state archives. When one archivist tried to digitize them in 1999, she reported that the scanner repeatedly failed to capture the images. Each attempt produced only a blurred gray surface, faintly rippled like disturbed water. She logged one final note before closing the project. "The file resists copying. It's as though it remembers being buried." That same year, a new drought lowered the waterline farther than it had been in half a century. Locals said the lake looked thinner somehow, as if the river beneath were holding its breath, waiting. In the summer of 2002, the Tennessee Valley Authority authorized a limited dredging operation near Crane Hollow Lake to clear silt from the outflow tunnels. The water levels had dropped after an unusually dry spring, exposing areas unseen since the 1970s drought. Among the crew was equipment operator Marcus Ellery, who later told a local journalist that the job started like any other day, mud, noise, and diesel fumes, but ended with something that shouldn't have been there at all. At first, the dredge brought up ordinary debris, branches, clay, pieces of old piping. Then, around midday, the excavator struck something solid. The engine groaned, cables tightened, and out of the dark slurry came a heavy, rectangular shape wrapped in chains. The crew assumed it was a section of concrete, until one chain snapped and the mass broke open, revealing the unmistakable corner of a wooden box. Inside, beneath a layer of silt and river stones, lay a rusted shovel and a small journal sealed in waxed cloth. The journal's cover bore the initials E.C. Ellery, swore the pages were still dry inside, as if they'd been protected from the water for a century. The first entry, dated April 1862, began in tight, steady handwriting. "The field will not rest. The count is wrong." Further entries were nearly illegible, water damaged, written in overlapping ink, but fragments could be read. They left them shallow. "The river takes what I give. Still hungry." The pages were turned over to the county sheriff, who forwarded them to the state archives. 2 weeks later, the documents were classified under historical evidence and quietly removed from public record. No official statement was released. But a photograph of the discovery, taken on Ellery's disposable camera, survived. It shows the journal resting on the riverbank, the wooden cover split slightly open. Behind it, half buried in mud, is what appears to be the shape of a human face, sunken, eyeless, yet eerily intact. Forensic experts later dismissed it as a distortion of clay and light. Locals weren't so sure. After the dredging resumed, divers reported hearing mechanical interference over their radios, low rhythmic pulses echoing through the headsets. One diver compared it to a heartbeat inside the earth. When they surfaced, their equipment showed no signal source. The foreman ordered the day's work halted. By nightfall, the water had turned darker, thickened by silt stirred from the depths. That same week, Ellery left town. He told friends the discovery had changed something in the air. Years later, his widow revealed he'd kept one item from the dredge site, a small brass button engraved AR. He claimed it came loose from the journal's binding. The same initials had appeared before, belonging to Sheriff Amos Redden, lost 80 years earlier. In the months following the operation, power fluctuations plagued the dam's control room. Monitors flickered, gauges failed, and workers complained of hearing faint metallic tapping from the lower tunnels. When a technician joked that it was just the old crane keeping count, his supervisor told him never to use that name on site again. The journal was never returned. A later Freedom of Information request confirmed that an item matching its description had been transferred to a federal archive for preservation and study. The file remained sealed. To this day, no one knows what became of the rest of the dredged material. Unofficial accounts claim it was buried under concrete, deep within the dam's restricted section, exactly where the sonar once detected rhythmic movement. As for the river, it has gone quiet again. But fishermen say that when the water runs low and the wind is still, you can see a faint flicker of light beneath the surface. Like a lantern swinging slowly back and forth. By the 2010s, Crane Hollow Lake had slipped back into obscurity. Tourists drove past without knowing the name, and most maps labeled it only as Hollow Reservoir. Yet the story of Elias Crane refused to die. It migrated, like rumor always does, through late-night radio, history podcasts, and true crime message boards. People called him America's forgotten cannibal, but those who studied the files closely noticed something stranger. In none of the early reports, not once, did anyone witness Crane killing. They only saw him digging. In 2012, a graduate student named Rachel Dorr from Vanderbilt University, working in the same department once led by Professor Dunn, petitioned to review Dunn's sealed materials for her dissertation on postbellum myth in rural Tennessee. The request was granted. Within the Dunn collection, she discovered something no one expected, a single photograph contact print that had never been catalogued. It was faint but legible, the Tennessee River at night, mist curling along the surface. In the lower left corner, just visible through the grain, was the silhouette of a man half submerged, his hands pressed into the water as if shaping it. Rachel digitized the image. The software automatically tagged the file name from the inscription on the back, Crane Count 1962.jpg. Within days, the image leaked online and circulated through forums devoted to unsolved historical mysteries. Viewers claimed that each time they opened it, the waterline in the picture seemed slightly higher, as though the lake within the image was slowly rising. Others swore they could see reflections forming under the man's face, pale and numerous, like the suggestion of other bodies below. The university later denied that any such file existed. Rachel withdrew from her program soon after. Her final email to her advisor read, "The count was never finished. It's still being kept." Since then, the Hollow Creek legend has become something between folklore and forbidden history. Amateur divers occasionally attempt to locate the original town site when the water dips in summer, but no official expeditions are allowed. The Corps of Engineers maintains that the reservoir floor is unstable, prone to collapse. Still, every few years, there's a story. A missing kayaker, a light under the water, the faint tolling of metal from nowhere. Locals along the Tennessee River call it the Keeper's Breath. On nights when the fog drifts low and the water lies perfectly still, they say you can hear shovels striking clay 3 times, then silence. The old mark, half cross, half circle, still appears carved into stones near the shore. No one claims to know who makes them, and none stay long enough to watch. In the county courthouse, deep in the restricted archives, one document remains unscanned. Its envelope bears no return address, only the typed words. Hollow Creek, Addendum 2012. Inside, according to a clerk who once handled it, lies a single page written in a modern hand, unsigned. The ink is faint, almost washed away, but under light the message is clear. The river keeps what it's given. Elias Crane was never the first. He was only the one who remembered. And so the story closes, without certainty, without comfort, just as the water covers the valley once more. Beneath the quiet surface of Tennessee's heartland, the earth still holds its breath, waiting for the next drought, the next whisper, the next count to begin again.